usual live stream. You're probably expecting to see Red Caffeine CEO Kathy Steele here today. Unfortunately, Kathy had to step away and has asked me to take over hosting duties. My name is Bill Skoronsky. I'm the Senior Content Marketing Manager here at Red Caffeine, which, for anyone who doesn't already know, is a growth consultancy. Red Caffeine, we build badass brands that people want to work with and work for. To learn more about our agency, please visit www.redcaffeine.com. Fortunately, I'm also not here alone today, as we have Tom LaTourette, a great friend of the show, here to co-host. Tom is a managing partner and certified trainer at M3 Learning, which is also one of our wonderful sponsors. Tom, thanks for joining me. Welcome aboard. It's good to see you again. I'm personally very excited
thank you, Bill.
to be
Thanks for
hosting
having
today.
me.
Yeah, you bet. I
Thank
know
you
I'm
for having me.
excited.
This will be a great conversation. Sorry.
Great. This is a topic that is going to touch on a few of my favorite subjects, buyer personas and customer research. So that means that I get to introduce one of the leading authorities on buyer personas and buying insights, who is our special guest today, Jim Kraus. Jim, welcome to the show. Thank you also for being here.
Great to be here. Thanks, Bill.
All right, moving ahead, Jim is the president of the Buyer Persona Institute. BPI has become the gold standard since 2010 for thousands of marketers and hundreds of companies when it comes to understanding buyers in order to give them confidence in the solutions that we want them to choose. Marketers like us at Red Caffeine and other agencies use these insights when we create strategies and messaging to, of course, drive more leads, improve the conversion rates that we're seeing, and ultimately to help sales hit their numbers. I hope Tom can speak to that at some point in the show as well as a sales trainer. Jim is also an avid blogger, and I can't recommend the Buyer Persona Buzz newsletter highly enough. I love it. I know a lot of other people enjoy it as well. But he's also working on a second edition of the book Buyer Personas with BPI founder Adele Ravella. We'll talk a bit about that later in the show. Jim, outside of work, I know you enjoy traveling and sports and spending time with your family, but I was curious if there's maybe a fun fact that you can share with us that isn't found in your bio.
Sure. And let me just say thanks for having me. I'm super excited to talk about, one of my favorite topics, buyer personas today. I guess I was trying to think about a fun fact for me, and the only thing that come to mind is I've been playing on a competitive men's league softball team for the last 20 years. We actually have a game tonight, and it's just one of my passions. It's one of those things that just really helps me kind of decompress after a work day. And I've been playing with these guys for, upwards of 20 years. So it's something I really enjoy, and I'm probably gonna have to give it up at some point, but I still enjoy doing it right now.
Now, Jim from Chicago, being from Chicago, is it 16-inch or 12-inch? Do you have all your knuckles, or is it the 12-inch?
I have all my knuckles. Yeah.
Okay.
Jim, it's funny you say that. I just had a game last night. I've been playing as well for 20 years. So I understand we're going to have to give it up someday, but I'm not ready just yet.
Right.
Not quite yet. I thought since this is the first time I'm here, I might include a fun fact about myself as well. While this is my first time hosting BAU, it's actually not the most pressure I've ever felt, not even this week, actually. A few days ago, I gave a presentation to a group of 10 people, and that was tough. They kept interrupting me. They were asking questions I couldn't answer, and they were not afraid to call me out when I slipped up. So everyone, please go easy on me today. I'll do the best I can. Parker, I think we have a slide from my presentation earlier in the week. I will do my best to keep everyone up to date.
Bill, I was just going to add something, just a fun fact. I am a children's book author, and I read to a class of fourth graders, and it sounds like they might have been the exact same audience as yours. They kept me honest, and they also did not let me off the hook on anything.
Yeah, they don't. That meeting I was referring to is actually opportunity I had to be the mystery reader at my daughter's preschool.
Yeah.
So those eyes don't come off of you, and they have harder questions than I think we'll get today. So hopefully all of this goes more smoothly than speaking to a group of 3, 4, and 5
Right.
year olds.
Yeah, exactly.
Of course, the reason that we're here today having this conversation is to help our audience think a little differently about what their customers are experiencing throughout their journey. And ultimately, that's so that we can effectively sell to them. Whether we're helping clients grow through new products or services, new markets, human capital, technology, or any of the 9 growth lanes that we focus on at Red Caffeine, every strategy has to align with what buyers want.
Yeah.
And the best way that we have to learn what buyers want is through research. I think Jim would agree with that. One of the issues that I know I see personally, and many of you watching probably do, is that one of the reasons marketers and sales pros struggle in this area is simply that they can't agree on a basic starting point, a definition even. I think if you ask 10 people what a buyer persona is, you're likely to get 10 different answers. And if you were to see buyer personas from 10 different companies, even if they're selling to the same customers in the same industry, they would look pretty different from one another, and how they're created, what information they contain, and certainly how useful they are. So I wanted to start by giving the Jim the floor a bit to tell us a little bit about BPI and how it is specifically that this organization does so well focusing on such a narrow niche that I think many of us unfortunately see overlooked every day. So, Jim, tell us a bit about BPI.
Sure. So, Buyer Persona Institute, or BPI, as we're commonly called, we were founded about 15 years ago, and quite honestly, our fundamental goal or mission really hasn't changed in all that time, and it's really to help marketers take all the guesswork out of what their prospective buyers need to know and experience to have full confidence in them and their solution. Right. And that mission, if you will, was really born out of it really kind of started with a frustration. And that is that, many times marketers who are charged with trying to develop marketing and sales strategies, messaging, positioning, where you really need to have a really in-depth understanding of your prospective buyers and the buying decisions they're making. We're going to probably talk a lot about that today. Are trying to do it with one hand tied behind their back because they really don't have firsthand knowledge about what their prospective buyers' needs are. What are their concerns about a particular purchase? What are they looking to achieve? How are they evaluating their options, and who's involved in the decision process? Just really basic information that can make the difference between really effective marketing and marketing that sounds like everybody else and is really white noise. So we were founded 15 years ago really to use some very pragmatic approaches to develop buying insights that marketers can use immediately, really just about anything they're working on. So that's why, we remain as excited now as we did back then when we first started the organization. And I think the thing I'm most excited about today is just an opportunity to talk about buyer personas, maybe in a way that some of the folks listening in haven't really heard before, or if they have, it'll spark maybe some additional curiosity around how they can use buyer personas to really as a cheat sheet for all the marketing and sales efforts that they're going to have going on in the coming years.
Yeah, you spoke a bit about the history of BPI and how it goes back so far. In that time, I'm curious to hear how buyer personas have evolved and how the importance of them, perhaps over the last 2 to 3, 5, even 10 years, has changed. What's your perspective on that?
Yeah. So of course, I'm going to be biased, but candidly, buyer personas, how we look at buyer personas, and we'll talk about that more in a minute, are as important or even more important than they were 2, 5, 10 years ago. And there's really a number of reasons for that. Again, when I say buyer persona, I'm talking about really understanding the buying decision very specifically, and we'll get into that. But a couple of things that just come to mind is one is, buying is not getting more easy, right? You hear a lot about how selling is hard. Buying is hard too, right? Particularly when you're talking about high consideration products and services. a lot of times buyers have never thought about a particular product or service category until they actually need it.
Yeah.
And right now they're inundated with just so much information, some of it conflicting, some they're just trying to understand and make heads or tails of. And they're looking for trusted advisors and providers that can help them. So understanding the buying decision and what their needs are and their outcomes and their fears and concerns is super important now, so that you can be laser focused, so you can be very relevant with your buyers as soon as you can.
Yeah.
Another big reason for it is what I want to call the, kind of the indecision pandemic, if you will. And that is, for folks that work with sellers quite a bit, one of the biggest challenges they have is, the dreaded no decision, right? And that a lot of times we see that buyers just don't really pick anybody. They just end up choosing nothing. And there was a book that came out a couple of months ago by Matthew Dixon and Ted McKenna called The Jolt Effect. And they did this great research where they analyzed millions of sales conversations between sellers and buyers over the course of a year period. And they analyzed them. And one of the things they found out is a lot of times there's indecision. It's not because buyers prefer the status quo. That's kind of conventional wisdom. More than half the time, it's because they simply are unable to make a decision. And a lot of times it's because they just have so much information and they're just afraid of messing up. They're afraid of, upsetting the apple cart, if you will. So again, another reason that you want to be really locked into what your buyer's needs are, so that they look at you as the trusted advisor.
You talk a lot about complex buying decisions, and I think that's particularly relevant for the B2B audience. Tom, I'm sure you've seen in your experience too that there's a lot of misperception around what a buyer persona actually is and what it's not. I'd like both of you to speak to that. Actually, if you could walk us through what you've heard included in buyer personas that is kind of shake your head at and wonder that that's really not that important, and really at the end of the day, what it comes down to that is most important to have in your buyer persona. Start with Jim, and then Tom, if you could come in from a sales standpoint.
Yeah.
So we have a very specific definition of what a buyer persona is and what it's not. And it really quite honestly makes all the difference in the world. So for us, the common view of a buyer persona, or the view that a lot of folks have had, is that a buyer persona is, if you will, a fictional avatar of an individual or a role that might be involved in a particular purchase decision. So for example, let's say you sell CRM software, and you may say, hey, we need a buyer persona for the CIO role because we think they're going to be, or know where they're going to be involved in the decision process. And you collect information about their age, their education, maybe even their overall priorities and challenges. But that literally tells you nothing about the buying decision that they're making around CRM. You're still guessing at what they really need to feel confident in you and your solution. So a buyer persona is really detailed information about what the buying committee for that CRM solution in our organization really needs to know, and what they need to experience to have confidence in you and your solution. Big distinction and big difference between buyer personas that get used and buyer personas that don't.
Yeah, Tom, you can probably speak to that from a sales standpoint. How does a sales team interpret that in order to find something that's useful from a buyer persona in helping
Well,
them
we're big believers,
understand the
Bill,
decision?
and Jim talked about this issue. We call it when you're ghosted or indecision. If we're having trouble at the end of a sales cycle, having somebody make a decision, it means that we probably haven't had the right conversation on the front end. And it's that space of really allowing the client, first, we've got to understand the problem, the issue, the challenge that they're having, why they would even need this solution, what's going on, what's causing them to pick up the phone, start this research, or even what would cause them to do it. And one of the things we tell our salespeople is you have to know the problem and you have to know the size of that problem. And too many salespeople, it's a push. They just want to talk about themselves instead of learning about the client. And if you have that buyer persona information ahead of time, it really allows you to speak intelligently to the client, maybe have a better understanding of what types of problems they're encountering, why they would need this solution. And then you're already in a validation conversation. We teach folks especially senior level people, they don't want to be educated. They want to be validated. And knowing that buyer persona allows you to see, can my solution actually validate what they're looking for? So it's critical. I think in today's selling world, buyer personas and understanding of that are absolutely critical.
Hmm. Yeah. Now we've already got the slide on the screen, and Jim, I'd like you to touch on these key components. I think this really gets into the meat of the conversation because most people don't think of the insights and the process of buying as the most important part of the persona. So, Jim, I want to have you walk us through the 5 rings of buying insight as produced by BPI.
Sure. So the 5 rings of buying insight is, that's just a name we gave to it. But what's really important is these 5 categories of information. And I think for anybody in the marketing, sales, or even product that are, in the audience today, I think hopefully this will be very logical to you. I mean, that's one of the things that we like about using this approach. So buyer personas basically have a few key components, and you're really trying to get buying insights around a specific buying decision. So again, wherever you're sitting, think about whatever product or service or products or services that you offer in the marketplace, maybe hone in on one. And what you're looking to do is get insights in 5 key areas by talking to recent buyers that have made that exact same buying decision. So imagine you've got a product that you're trying to figure out how do you market and sell better. You're going to go find people that made that exact same buying decision in the last 6 to 12 months, and you're going to interview them. We'll talk a little more about that perhaps later on. But you're looking to dig 5 key areas. One is priority initiatives. And priority initiatives think of these as the trigger, right? So these are the reasons that somebody is starting their search and evaluation. They're even picking up the phone, starting a Google search, talking to a colleague, whatever it may be. It's likely they had this challenge or maybe opportunity for a lengthy period of time. But what is the reason that now they're really getting started? And that's so important because you want to meet buyers where they are, and you want to know what is the impetus for this, right? Again, kind of going back to what we were talking about earlier, you want to be very relevant to them very quickly. The second one is success factors. Think of success factors these are the benefits or end results or outcomes that buyers want from making the investment in your product or service, right? At the end of the day, what is the most important things that they need to achieve? Some of them may be very, metric driven, very hard and fast. Some of them may be much softer than that. You want to know what all of those are so that when you talk about results and outcomes, you're talking it in the buyer's terms. You're not talking about here's what my solution can do and all the things. You're talking about, hey, here's how my solution can help you achieve these outcomes that you care a great deal about. The third one is perceived barriers. This is one of my favorite ones because, particularly for high consideration buying decisions that we were talking about earlier, you can bet that buyers are going to have some trepidation, right? This is potentially a significant investment for them. They're using something now that's working for better or worse, probably. There's probably multiple decision influencers. There may be a lot on the line if the thing works or doesn't work in whatever they buy. So you want to know what those fears and concerns are, again, ahead of time so that they inform your marketing and sales. Absolutely critical. Fourth is decision criteria. And when we say decision criteria, again, think about the actual buying decision. We're talking about what are the actual questions that you can expect buyers to have of you when they're evaluating their alternatives. Yeah. And the way you collect these is literally finding out how do they winnow down their choices. We'll talk about how we get this information, but it's not surveys and ratings and ranking. It's literally finding out what happened. Like, what were the things that got you in the consideration set? What were the key questions and things they were looking at different competitive alternatives that got somebody to stay in the consideration set, or you got dropped out, or you ultimately got chosen or not. So understanding exactly what those decision criteria is so powerful. And then the last one is buyer's journey. And buyer's journey is steps, and no buyer's journey is the exact same, but by talking to recent buyers, you can definitely pick up on some pretty significant patterns, if you will, as far as what are the key steps in their process, what are the information sources that they use and they trust to collect a point of view about what they're looking at, who are the influencers in the decision, and who's actually making that final decision. Now, if you're a marketer seller, just think for a minute. Like if you had this information, think about the product or service I mentioned earlier. Think about if you had this information. It was fact-based. It was based on interviews that you recently did with recent buyers. You're taking all the guesswork out of this stuff. Right now, you can focus all your time and attention, on using your creative talents to really come up with some compelling things that buyers say, hey, these guys really get me, right? And then you start becoming that trusted advisor, and you start talking in their language.
It's such an important part.
Speaking
in their language.
This is so powerful. We see so many organizations struggle with starting this conversation. And because they don't know this, they start a conversation about themselves instead of about the client. And that's what loses energy in the deals. And Jim, you've nailed it. I mean, this is the Bible. If you can start here, this is exactly what creates energy, what creates sales opportunities that don't get ghosted and actually allow the client to go, yeah, you guys heard me, you get me. This is great.
And as we get to that point with these questions and these insights lead us towards is building a better buyer persona profile. So Jim, I'd like you to speak a little bit about what those look like from the Buyer Persona Institute. And I think we have a slide coming up in which we'll lay that out in a template, but talk a little bit about what we'll see on the screen here in a minute.
Yeah, so the buyer profile, which we'll pull up, it's really kind of we look at this page as the cover sheet for our buyer persona. You may look at this and say, hey, that's what our buyer personas actually look like today. For us, it's just a cover page, and it includes when we actually talk to recent buyers, it includes insights about people that are actually involved in the decision process. So I know we can't see it, but if it comes up, it includes things like, what are the roles and titles of the people that are involved in this buying decision? What is a typical education that they have? What are their overall priorities? Not priorities specific to this buying decision, but just generally speaking, what else is on their plate, right? So you can kind of get in their head a little bit, say, okay, we're focused on this buying decision they're making, but it's really good to have that background and understand some of the other stuff. And then also it's great to also have information sources as well, as far as information sources that they use and trust. So here it is. This came up a little bit late, but this is really just a cover page to the buyer persona. So the 5 rings of insight I mentioned earlier, that's really the nuts and bolts of it. This is just a way to get your head around, like, okay, who are the decision influencers? And you get those insights as well, just kind of to complete your buyer persona.
Well, you mentioned a word, trust, and I think that's absolutely critical. The earlier you can establish trust with a client, where they feel like they're being heard, they feel like you understand their issue, their problem, and you're not just selling them something. One of the things we talk about is buyers, most of the time they want to buy, they just don't want to be sold. And understanding this really takes you away from being a salesperson, and now you operate almost like a consultant. Great.
Yep.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And what we've seen a lot is there's typically some reactive pushback when we ask companies about interviewing their recent customers and their prospects. And I'm not sure if you have a handle on where that comes from, Jim, or if you've heard it as well, Tom, but we can't overstate how much value there is in customer interviews, not only in developing personas, but getting at the heart of things that we can't otherwise learn. So I'm curious how you approach gathering those insights that feed into these profiles and the rest of the information that becomes so important.
Yeah, it's really critical to get this information from recent buyers. And let me just define recent buyers, because it's helpful, right? Because a lot of times we use the word buyers and customers interchangeably. I would advocate, I'm not saying don't talk to your current customers. Your current customers can be an invaluable source of information. You may want to talk to them to help add some additional information for your buyer persona. But if at all possible, our recommendation is to talk to recent buyers, ones that made that buying decision, but aren't necessarily your current customers. Some of them may be, and that's fine. But you want to talk to folks that you would ideally have wanted in your sales pipeline, right? I mean, that's particularly from a new client acquisition standpoint, that's who you're trying to attract, right? So go find recent buyers that have made that decision in the last 12 months and do in-depth interviews with them. So what I mean by in-depth interviews is, again, not surveys and ratings and rankings per se. There's a place for that. And maybe that's another conversation down the road we could have. But what we're talking about is 30 to 40-minute conversations. The only scripted question we typically ask is, take me back to the day when you first decided that you needed X, and X would be whatever product, service, or solution that the focus is. And tell me what you did first. Tell me what happened. And then literally over that discussion, walk them through the entire buying journey from the moment they had an initial need all the way until they made that final decision. Find out how, what information sources and how people were put on the initial consideration set. Find out how they cut their choices. You know, a lot of times, particularly for high consideration decisions, they may be, you know, cutting their choices from a certain set down to, you know, maybe going from 10 to 4 to 2 to a winner. Find out how they did that. What was that process like? What information was critical? You know, what got people to remain in consideration versus not? What kinds of fears and concerns did you have along the way? All those kinds of things are going to fill out the information that we talked about earlier, which is your 5 rings of buying insight. And I can't emphasize enough how important it is. And if we could flip to the next slide, just to make one last point about why interviewing recent buyers is so important, is one of the things that you want to include in your buyer personas, if at all possible, is not just the insights that I mentioned, but also include actual buyer quotes from the interviews that you do. And the reason that's so important is this is an example of a buyer persona page for priority initiatives. So that was the first one that I mentioned, which is triggers. The blue stuff at the top is just buying insights. And this happens to be for a large equipment manufacturer. And you can see all the smaller gray font below is buyer quotes. The reason including buyer quotes for all the insights that you identify is, one, it lends almost instant credibility to the findings, right? Because your whole organization is going to say, hey, these are the folks that we really want to understand. Gosh, who is this? I would have wanted to know about this opportunity, right? Those kinds of things. The second thing it does is it immediately lets you really get in the mind of the buyer. You see how they talk about things. You see how they discuss different vendor options. You start kind of really feeling like you can feel their angst, their pain, their excitement about a potential purchase. So it does a lot of different things. That's why these conversations are so important. And for marketers that are nervous about it, doing it, or sellers about doing it, there's resources that we can point you that you can use to kind of help, figure out, how do I find these people? How do I talk to them and do the analysis? But go right to the source. There's really no reason not to.
I'm going to add, I think one other advantage to this is your client. This helps them justify the decision that they made, the reason they're doing business with you. It probably cements that relationship at a really high level. And if I'm going to, we talk a lot about how do you land and expand in a business. This is a really powerful way for them to see you as somebody who, I made a great decision here, and these guys are just confirming that decision I made, and I want to keep doing business with them. It's really, really great.
There's a skill set there, Jim, that I hope you can touch on a bit. One of the reasons that I think we see so many companies struggle with this is that they just don't have those investigative interview skill sets within sales and marketing. I know my background's in journalism, so it comes naturally to me to ask those questions, but I know that's not inherent to everyone. So I was hoping you could touch on what kind of person a company has to have, or what type of people the Buyer Persona Institute has that makes that successful, as opposed to just asking a list of scripted questions, as you mentioned earlier.
Yeah, I mean, because we actually have a master class available on our website for those that want to really get into this and maybe get trained up a little bit on some of this stuff. But let me just talk in broad strokes, at least a couple of tips here. we've literally done thousands of buyer interviews over the years. So we know how to get to these people, wherever the buying decision is, and how to talk to them. But a couple of key things. One is, go into it with an innate sense of curiosity, right? Don't go into the interview saying, look, the person I'm talking to has a story to tell, right? And the nice thing about these interviews is you're not asking them to pontificate about something, right? They're literally telling you what actually happened. And they love doing it because the reality is this buying decision is probably something that was really important to them in their organization. And they really enjoy actually telling you what happened. So we always go into our interviews thinking like, okay, I've got the 5 rings of buying insight in mind. Those are the conversation points I need to get to. We also go into it making sure that we're always asking probing questions. So let me just give you one example of that. If somebody says, it was really important that let's say it's a technology product. It was really important that the technology product was easy to use. Well, what do you mean by easy to use? Right? You follow up with a question, and then they will tell you specifically what they mean by ease of use. Ease of use, it could be in this case, non-IT, quote unquote, business users are able to use it very quickly, and the training is very straightforward. And the user interface is really easy to use, right? So do follow-ups, right? So never take them at the first answer, because there's always a second and third sentence. So have the patience to kind of talk through it and make sure you understand it. And one more tip I can give you is, some folks ask us, well, how long are the interviews? And they're typically 30 to 40 minutes. But my best barometer of the end of an interview is when I feel like I literally understand everything that happened in that particular buyer's journey and why it happened and why it was important. And if you have those questions in mind, you almost become very effective at asking questions and probing, because it's just natural, right? It's just natural conversation.
Tom, how does that
Jim,
factor in from sales training standpoint?
Go ahead, Bill. I'm sorry. I was going to ask a quick question, but go ahead. What would you?
I was going to ask how that factors in from a sales standpoint. Those are a lot of questions that I'm sure salespeople should be asking, or you'd like them to be asking.
Yeah, they really should. And I love what you said, Jim. It's all about being curious. And the more curious I am, the less I want to tell, the less I want to sell, the more I want to learn. I got to think, Jim, when you approach it that way, that many times those 30-minute meetings turn into 45-minute meetings, 50-minute meetings, hour and a half, because people want to talk about themselves and the decisions they've made, especially at higher levels in an organization.
Yeah, we book them for 30 minutes usually, but I would say 8 out of 10 times we'll ask them as we get towards the interview, because we haven't gotten everything we need. We'll ask them if they can hang on for a few minutes. And unless they have a really, really hard stop, they almost always give us the time, because again, they're enjoying the conversation.
Well, I know we have a hard stop at the top of the hour. So I saw a really good question come in through the chat, and I wanted to give you a chance to answer that now, Jim. The question was, how do you get a non-customer to give up that kind of time to share when they have very little invested in you, and especially when they don't have a lot of time with their own suppliers? Any advice in response to that question?
You pay them is the short answer. And I don't mean, and I'm saying that kind of tongue in cheek, but the reality is, this is research, right? You're doing research with buyers. There's all kinds of different market research studies that you can do, but this is research with buyers at the end of the day. And folks are very used to, particularly in today's world, particularly in the business markets, folks are very used to being asked to have discussions, and paid discussions for that matter. So what we do is we work with some of our recruiting partners that we've worked with for years. We give them very specific screening requirements about who we want to talk to or not talk to, depending on a particular study. They help us find those folks. And then we offer incentive for them to participate. And a lot of times what we do is we let them donate it to a charity if they'd like, because their organization may not let them take the money directly, or they're just not comfortable doing it, and that's totally fine.
Sure.
But that's generally the way we do it. The other way you can do it is you can also offer them a certain piece of thought leadership material as well, or some type of, high level insights about the study. We don't do that as much, but usually monetary is really the way to go. And it has been for, quite honestly, decades.
Sure. So
Yeah.
let's say you've gotten to the point where you've developed your buyer persona.
Can I add so
What's
before we go off of that, because I think this question is really important.
Yeah,
Um,
go ahead.
I, you know, what we see is just too many, too many salespeople don't ask the question because they think they won't get the time. Now, imagine if I'm doing business with a supplier and they're not asking me these types of questions. If I'm a, if I'm just coming in to learn about your business and I start asking these buyer persona questions, I'm going to be, I'm going to feel like you're somebody who hears me, understands me, and you're not here to just sell me something. And especially if my supplier's not asking me these questions, it's going to differentiate you in the field. I don't know if Jim, would you agree with that?
No question about it. In fact, when we talk to some of our clients, the first question I'll ask them is, tell me what you're, how what you view as a buyer persona and what kind of value you're really trying to get out of it. Before I start talking about any of this stuff, you have to know what they're what's their end objective, what are they trying to do? So that's critical. And again, it immediately gives that prospect confidence that you care about what they're trying to achieve, and the next logical step is we're going to figure out a way to help you.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you're not just trying to sell me something. You're trying to solve a problem that I have. You're trying to fix something. And most of these organizations, if that problem is big enough, I'm going to find the time because I have to fix that. I have to solve it. I have to move it along.
It's really about that pain. Is the pain
Yeah.
great enough that's going to cause you to act, or is it not? And that goes back to the initial point that Jim made about what the trigger is. Why is it that you're solving that problem now as opposed to you've probably had this problem for 6 months, but why is it today that we're talking about solving this problem? Why has it become such a big issue that you can't wait anymore to do that?
We call the difference in most organizations below the line and above the line. And so if you were to think about your C-level folks as above the line, but every above the line person has, we call them trains. They've got 5 or 6 high priorities that they have to fix, they have to solve. And a buyer persona helps you understand what those possible trains might be. And then you can see how you fit inside of that. And now we're having a conversation about the problem instead of about the solution.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I want to move us forward into what organizations do next. Once they have developed a buyer persona, whether it's with the institute or an agency like us or someone else, what should they do after that? Once they have this profile, where do they go from there?
So 2 things. One is a lot of times you'll know what to do with it. Like when you have a buyer persona and you have these insights and you're in marketing and sales profession, you can't help but come up with ways to start using it, right? Immediately, messaging as an example, like right away, you're going to have a really good understanding about what buyers want. So that's number one. But the second thing, just to be a little more specific, and thank you for putting this chart up. And this is something we can't recommend enough. If you have the discipline to do it and you can get the right folks in your organization to do this exercise, we'd encourage a workshop, if you will, or a couple of meetings, if you will, to figure out what I'm showing on this diagram. So this is a simple Venn diagram. The red circle on the left is what buyers want and need. These are all the insights that you got from your buyer persona, right? They're all the 5 things we talked about earlier, the triggers, the outcomes you want, what are the fears and concerns they have, how are they going to evaluate you, what's their steps in the buyer's journey. So you're going to have that red circle, you're going to be rock solid on it. The right-hand side is the other side of the equation. What does your company do and what do you guys do well, right? And you want to find the intersection between those two. So what we recommend doing is taking each of the insights that you find in your buyer persona and then mapping it to your organization in 2 ways. Number one is come up with a determination about how important you think each one of these are, each one of these different, and maybe they're all important, maybe some are more important than the other. You can definitely use your own institutional knowledge about that, or there's other ways you can get it. The second thing we recommend doing is once you've got those insights, if you will, figure out which you think are really differentiating, right? Because you could find that, let's go back to that example I gave earlier, like ease of use. is really important. But you look at the market and some of the competitors out there and you say, well, we really can't differentiate much on that because either A, everybody kind of does a good job on it, or most people do, or B, it's a weakness for us. It's something we're not actually good at.
Yeah.
So what you want to do is find that sweet spot. What are the things buyers want and need very badly? What are the things that you do really, really well? And develop message themes around those things. And the reason that's so important is because now, from a marketing and sales perspective, you go out to market and you feel confident that buyers want it and need it, and you feel confident in your story, right? Because you've done the homework to do that mapping. And Tom can probably attest. A lot of times, one of the biggest challenges sales folks have is trying to figure out, what do I talk about? Give me 2 or 3 dot points to talk about. Well, here's your dot points, right? Here's some things that we did our homework on, and we can feel pretty good that your buyers are going to have this need, and we did our homework, and here's the story you can tell, right? So you can use it in marketing, you can use it in sales. So that's a great way to get started and make it from, this vast pool of buying insights into, all right, what do we really want to focus in on that's going to be right for our organization so that we can put ourselves in the best light in meeting our buyers' needs.
Really great.
It's incredible to see that Venn diagram, because that's exactly how we address content marketing at Right Caffeine. We have a Venn diagram that our clients would recognize that on the red circle, as you have here, it's what do customers want to learn? What do they need to find out? And on the other side, it's, well, what do we do best? Where's our center of influence? Where's our thought leadership? And that sweet spot in the middle is where we focus the majority of the content. So let's make sure that we're speaking to the needs of the buyers, but also the strengths of our organization. So that's a perfectly familiar way of looking at it. And I imagine that applies to a lot of different areas where you're considering both your outside audience and what you do very well. So I appreciate you sharing this here.
Yeah, it's really the difference. Like in me, I'll hear a lot of salespeople, hey, what keeps you up at night? That's the difference between that question and, what we've seen from somebody at your level in industry like yours or with your persona. Our existing clients are telling us that they're worried about this issue, this issue, this issue. They need to fix this. Which one of those 3 is keeping you up at night? That's a completely different question, right? And if you can ask a question like that with this information, the customer is going to say, wow, these guys kind of understand my business. They kind of understand my needs. Now, let me give them more information. Let me share what I'm struggling with, instead of the first question is somebody kind of fishing for a solution that they're going to try to sell me on.
Yeah. And if you do this correctly, if you go all the way with this, it's great to also develop your proof points, right? So you come up with your message themes. When we work with clients, we typically come up with 4, 5, 6 at the most, like overall themes. And the detailed stuff is in the proof points, right? So ease of use, again, using that example, right? That's kind of a broad category, but an important one a lot of times, particularly for technology stuff. But you may have 4 or 5 great proof points around that, right? And now you've armed your sales force and you've really focused your marketing efforts around those proof points.
Helps me become a better storyteller. It helps me really. And yeah, it's really powerful.
Mm-hmm. Let's continue down that track. Before we wrap up with another audience question, I think it makes sense to talk about what outcome we see here, what difference there is, what sorts of results organizations should expect to achieve when they leverage what we would consider more modern buyer personas, whether it's in their sales or in their marketing activities. Jim, what would you say is typically noticeable for those organizations?
There's probably a couple of soft and harder metrics I can talk to, or results. The softer stuff, and I'm mentioning it because it's pretty important, because it ultimately impacts some of the business performance stuff. Is what's remarkable is how much alignment we see across marketing, sales, and product areas that embrace personas this way and do persona studies to get these insights. It just brings everybody together and everybody's on the same page, and that has a lot of value. Another thing that we see is, particularly in today's tougher economic environment, right, is it's really helping marketing their focus and their prioritization. Marketing, and for example, is always having things thrown over to them. Can you give me this? Can you give me that? let's try this, let's do that. You're throwing stuff against the wall, and you only have so much time and resources and money, right? Particularly in today's environment. So the buyer persona gives you so much better focus as far as where do we really want to spend our time, right? The buyer's journey helps you figure out where you need to be, and the rest of it tells you what do we need to be saying and what do we need to be communicating. The other place we see it is messaging. And the messaging seems like the obvious one, but let me just say one thing about it is that with these 5 areas of insight, you're getting messaging that's going to inform your top, middle, and bottom of funnel, right? So, priority initiatives are your triggers, and your success factors are your desired results. A lot of times that's top of the funnel kind of stuff. Buyers want to see that, hey, they seem to know what we want and what we need. They get it. But once you get into middle funnel, bottom of funnel, when they're really starting to evaluate your choices, that's where you really want to know what their perceived barriers are, right? Their fears and concerns. You want to know what decision criteria they're using. So it really helps organization optimize their messaging up and down that sales funnel. From a harder metric standpoint, the 2 places that we see, one we see and be the ones that we probably like the most is getting increase in qualified leads, meaning that you are connecting with your ICPs, right? Your ideal customer profiles. You are connecting with the buyers that really make sense for them and they make sense for you, right? It's kind of like it, right? When you start talking, having those conversations. So because of all the work that you've done, you've just by default come up with your ICP positioning and messaging. And then the other place that we love to see it is, and that we often see, is improvements in conversion rates. And that's for the reasons I mentioned a moment ago, which is just doing a really better job of messaging, communications, giving buyers what they need in the later stages of the buying cycle. So those are the places that we see it the most often. We often get feedback that people change their taglines, they change their positioning, they change their messaging, they run new campaigns, an abundance of different marketing motions, if you will. But I think the 4 things I mentioned, 4 or 5, are probably the ones that are the most impactful that we see.
I'd see also when you think about conversion rates, we'll force organizations to think about days in sales cycle. I would have to think, Jim, that if you do this right, you're able to shrink days in sales cycle by 10, 15, 30%. Are you seeing things like that?
Yeah, we don't have any hard metrics on it. I'm going to say, yes, I think that's happening. And that's a little bit of tea leaf reading. But yeah, I think it's for all the reasons that I mentioned. I think that's very fair to say that is a likely outcome.
Yeah, I'm going to say no question in my mind. I think, the organizations we see that, and just sometimes just by having the salesperson ask the question shaves off 2 or 3 weeks out of the sales cycle. And
well, we've got a few more minutes here and a few questions that have come in here at the end. So I'd like to do just a quick fire round. Jim, if you could take maybe 30 seconds or so to answer each one of these questions. We'll see how many we can get in here at the end. This question asks specifically if there's a general idea of how many customers or prospects you feel like you need to really get a handle on generalizing a persona.
Yeah, great question. So our rule of thumb is 10 interviews. If you're doing a buyer persona around a one buying decision, 10 interviews, I don't want to say it's the magic number. It's a good number to do. The reason for it is if you do less than 10, what ends up happening is you just have a hard time really picking up on patterns in the data across the interviews that you do. And you end up getting some insights that you're not sure if they're just anecdotal and one-offs, or are these really things that you're seeing across the different organizations that you're interviewing. Any more than 10, and again, you can do as many as you want. I would never tell anybody not to do recent buyer interviews because you get so much value out of them. But what we've seen is once you get past 10, it's usually diminishing returns. You start hearing generally the same things. You're not picking up any new insights. So, because time, money, and resources it's never infinite. 10's a really good number to target.
Yeah, as a B2B sales process is so long sometimes, can last 12 to 18 months. Do you find that it's difficult to go back to recent buyers and have them bring you back to 12, 18 months ago at that after they've made the purchase?
Yeah, we generally don't talk to anybody that hasn't gone through a buying decision in the past 12 months. Quite often, we talk to ones that have gone through it more recently than that. We have talked to recent buyers that have been 12 to 18 months, and that tends to be a little bit longer than we'd ideally like. But having said all of that, again, this is something that really probably meant a heck of a lot to them. This buying decision, it was pretty important, and it's amazing how much details they can actually recall about it.
And even if I made the buying decision today, I may have been considering this for the past 9 months.
Exactly.
We may have had a lot of turnover in our organization, a lot of people contributing to the conversation. So historical context has got to be so important.
Yeah.
One general question that came in from the audience: if there's a big takeaway, one place that you'd recommend companies lean heaviest to move their buyer personas in the right direction, as we've been talking about today, what would you say is one big step forward that companies should be keeping front and center?
Without question, if you're doing buyer personas today that are focused on roles and individuals, think hard about whether that's really where you want to spend your time versus focusing on buyer personas that are based on buying decisions. Because what tends to happen is those kind of buyer personas that are just profiles of individuals gives you a little bit of information, but you're going to end up guessing at a lot of stuff. It's going to be leaps of faith. You're not going to have a ton of confidence. It's hard to bring the organization together around them. The other thing that we see a lot of times is that organizations end up having so many buyer personas, they don't have the resources to be able to even address them, and it makes it overly complex. And there really is no need to do that. You don't need to have 7 buyer personas for a single buying decision. Find out what's really important to the organization around that buying decision. Talk to different types of decision makers involved in it, and you will get at what's important, across all of them.
Yeah, we actually went to. We're never sure when we have these live streams how many questions we'll get from the audience. So I'm glad to see so many came through. But we actually went to ChatGPT and we put in a prompt that said, hey, write us 5 questions that marketers want to know about buyer personas. Now, we obviously won't get into all of these today, so we'll include them in the recap of the show and put them out on social media to drive some of this conversation. But there was one question in specifically that I'd like you to address, and that's the topic around ensuring that B2B buyer personas are dynamic and that they're updated regularly. Because as we know, we don't have to look more than 3 years in the history to know that market conditions and buying behaviors change drastically, sometimes in a very quick period of time. So from your perspective, how would you suggest buyer personas are kept up to date and kept dynamic?
Yeah, so I get this question quite a bit, as you would imagine, and there is no hard and fast rule. Like, so if you're, and I know you're not asking me, but if you ask me, how frequently should you update your buyer personas, my answer is going to be it varies. And kind of the things you were just alluding to is what's really important. If you are in a marketplace that is very mature, doesn't change a whole heck of a lot, same competitors, same basic offerings, you don't have to update your buyer personas all that much, right? If nothing's changing. If you are in a market where customer needs are changing, you've got competitors in the market that are new, or more importantly, starting to address a particular buyer need in a different way, that's certainly reason to refresh your buyer persona. Same approach, right? You want to go out and find recent buyers. So it really depends on your market. I mean, we have some organizations that we work with that, update their buyer personas every 4 or 5 years. We have others that do so on an annual basis. It really all depends on the market. But that's the key question is, can you look at your buyer persona and say to yourself, we're confident that this reflects how buyers are making decisions for our particular solutions today. If you think things have changed, they probably have, and you want to take a look at it.
Now, I guess that question comes up in interviews. How has your buying process changed over the last 2 years, last 3 years, or certainly as you're rolling out new products and services, you have to learn that. You have to learn that all over again sometimes. So it's definitely good to keep those up to date. Tom, any closing thoughts from you before I wrap us up here?
Wow. I mean, other than this is probably our belief is this is probably one of the most critical things that today's seller has to do. And even if the organization isn't giving me buyer personas, just the fact what Jim said is, let's get better at asking these types of buyer persona questions instead of just blah 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 talking about my product. And then once I have a satisfied client, actually, instead of checking the box, great, I sold it, I'm going to go on to all my other deals. What can we learn from satisfied clients that maybe we can even grow our business? Maybe they'll refer us to other people if we start having these conversations. So, Jim, I absolutely love this. I think it's monumentally critical for success today, and I'm definitely going to have some further conversations with you about some clients that I'm thinking about that need to have conversations with you. So
great.
Yeah. Jim, thank you again. I can't say it enough for being here and for helping make us all smarter with the insights that you've brought and that Buyer Persona Institute brings to the table. I want to remind everyone that Jim can be reached through email or on LinkedIn, where I discovered him originally, or you can visit the Buyer Persona Institute website at www.buyerpersona.com. Thank you also to Tom and to M3 Learning, as well as HR Source and Insperity, our other incredible sponsors. And of course, thank you to everyone who attended today. Thank you for all the great questions. And last but not least, thank you especially to the people behind the scenes who make all of this possible. Parker, Matt, Dana, the whole team here at Red Caffeine, thanks for all your help. Finally, I encourage you to join us again next month. Our next Business as Unusual live stream is June 15th. And we're excited to have a great conversation on deck with Alana Wides about artificial intelligence, and particularly how companies can use it now, as opposed to watching their competition go past them, to reach some low-hanging fruit. And there's not really any reason to be afraid of it. We've been using AI for years without really thinking much about it. So I encourage you to go to our website and sign up for next month's BAU. And as always, if there are topics that you're struggling with in growing your company, please send them over to us, and we'll be happy to find a great guest like Jim and like Tom as well to help you hopefully think a little bit differently about how you can find success, and whether you have those resources internally or need to reach out to someone like M3 or like the Buyer Persona Institute or like Red Caffeine. I hope we help you find those answers. So hope to see you all again in June. Once again, thank you, everyone. This has been a blast, and let us know if there's any way we can help you in the future. Thanks, guys. I appreciate your time.